I'd like to follow on from our meditation last night and explore more deeply the relationship between experience, mind, and consciousness. We normally believe that experience is divided into two essential ingredients: mind on the inside and matter on the outside. We have a vague notion that mind lives somewhere inside the body, more specifically inside the brain, and contains within it all our thoughts, images, and feelings, and that mind knows the world made of matter, which is outside of it. That is a very simplistic statement of our of the conventional view of experience. So we start here by recognizing that all the mind ever knows or comes in contact with is its own content. In other words, that everything the mind knows or experiences takes place within itself. It's obvious that our thoughts and feelings take place inside mind. It's not so obvious that sensations of the body and perceptions of the world also take place in the mind. If you close your eyes for a moment and listen to whatever sounds are present, they take place in exactly the same, let's call it a space for the time being. These sounds take place in exactly the same place as do our thoughts and feelings. It is for this reason that when we fall asleep at night and the mind dissolves, the world dissolves. We have a belief that the world exists outside the mind, but nobody has ever or could ever find such a world, because all we ever know of a world is perception, and all perception takes place in the mind and is known by the mind. So just take some time to establish in your experience that everything you ever know or come in contact with takes place in your mind and is known by your mind. So the real question, the really interesting question is not what is the universe made of, but what is mind made of? In order to know the nature of anything that is known or experienced by the mind, it is first necessary to know the nature of mind itself. So look at your mind. Now, when I say look at your mind, I'm talking to the mind. Look at yourself. Look at what is going on inside yourself, you, the mind. It is a flow or a collection of thoughts and images and feelings and sensations. When I use the word sensation, for those of you that have not been on one of these retreats before, I use the word in a very specific sense. By sensation, I mean the experience of the body. The experience of your feet on the floor is a sensation, or your hands on your knees, that's a sensation. A toothache or the experience of hunger would be a sensation, or the temperature of the air on your skin, that is a sensation. So see that your mind consists of a flow of thoughts, images, feelings, sensations and perceptions. Perceptions, likewise, I use very specifically. It's the 5 sense perceptions: sights, sounds, tastes, textures, and smells. In other words, the sensations are the way we know the body, perceptions are the way we know the world. So just look again at your mind. You can do this either with your eyes open or closed. And just notice that your mind is a flow or a collection of thoughts, images, feelings, sensations, perceptions. Don't try to control your mind in any way. This is nothing to do with manipulating our experience. We want to know the nature of our experience. So feel free to let your mind go wherever it wants. Just simply notice that it is a flow of thoughts, images, feelings, sensations and perceptions. I refer to these sometimes as objects. So when I use the word objects, I don't just mean physical objects. I mean anything that has an objective quality, such as a thought or a feeling, or a taste or a sound. Notice that if the mind were simply a collection of objects, thoughts, images, sensations, perceptions, it would not be possible to know them. They would appear, as it were, in the dark. They wouldn't be experienced. They wouldn't be known. So there is obviously more to mind than simply a collection of objects. That is, there is more to mind than a collection of thoughts, images, feelings, sensations, and perceptions. There is another ingredient that constitutes mind. What is that? It is the knowing element of mind. Mind is knowing or aware. Now just do a thought experiment now. Imagine removing from your minds now the quality of knowing or being aware. You can't actually do it, but just imagine it. What would be left? What could we claim from experience would be left? It's tempting to say that nothing would be left. Because there would be no awareness to know it. But we couldn't even claim that there is nothing, because nothing would not be known. It is simply not possible even to imagine removing consciousness from experience. Thought cannot even imagine that. So look again at your minds. I'm talking to your mind. The mind is being invited to look at itself, to look at its own content, and see that it's a collection of objects, thoughts, images, feelings. But there is also something which we could call the knowing element or aware element. That lights up the objects, lights up experience, renders experience knowable. So now I'm suggesting that there are two elements to mind. An objective element, thoughts, images, feelings, and a knowing element. So we're straying back into duality here. So let's explore that. These are apparently two elements, the thought and the knowing, a feeling and the knowing of it. In other words, consciousness plus its object. So take now the experience of a thought. I suggest you keep our eyes closed. It's not essential, but take a thought, any thought or a series of thoughts, notice that that thought is known. We are aware of it. So we're suggesting two elements. One, a thought, and two, awareness or knowing. By the way, I go back and forth between the words awareness and consciousness. They're identical in the way I use the words. So there is the thought and the knowing of it. The awareness of it. Now, notice that when the first thought disappears, a second thought arises. But the knowing with which the first thought was known doesn't disappear when the first thought disappears. The knowing with which the first thought was known remains present and knows the second thought. The second thought disappears. The knowing with which the second thought was known remains. A third thought appears, and it is known by the same knowing that knew the first thought and the second thought. Now take another object in the mind, whatever sound is present. That sound is known. It is an object that is known. And when the sound, for instance the sound of my voice, disappears, the knowing with which it was known remains, and it knows the next sound. If you rub your fingers together, a new sensation appears. It is another object in the mind. That sensation is known. Stop rubbing your fingers together. The sensation dissolves, but the knowing with which it was known remains. Now just allow your mind to range freely over your entire experience. And see that it is always known by the same knowing. Notice that the objects that the mind knows or experiences are always changing. No thought, feeling, sensation or perception ever stays the same. objective content of the mind is, as such, a bit like a flowing river. It is never the same river. But what about the knowing with which this changing flow of experience is known? Does that ever change? Is there any difference between the knowing with which a toothache or a depression is known, and the knowing with which the sight of this room or the taste of a delicious meal is known? In other words, is the knowing quality of the mind ever changed or modified in any way by the objective content of experience? Since we've been sitting in this room for 20 minutes or so, all our thoughts, images, feelings, sensations and perceptions have changed numerous times. What about the knowing with which they were all known? What about the knowing with which our current experience is known? Does anything ever happen to that? Was the knowing with which you knew your experience 2 minutes ago different from the knowing with which you knew your experience 2 days ago, 2 weeks ago, 2 years ago, 20 years ago? Or does this knowing always remain in exactly the same condition? take the experience of the body. It is just a series. All we can say of the body is that it is a series of sensations and perceptions in the mind. Take your experience of the body over the last 30, 50, 70 years. Innumerable sensations and perceptions. And each time we perceive, each time we experience a perception, the perception seems to be a little older. But what about the knowing with which each of these perceptions is known? Has that knowing aged? Or is the knowing with which we know our current experience still in the same pristine condition that it was in when we were 5-year-old girls and boys? Has anything happened to the knowing? Has it grown old? Has it been dimmed or tarnished by experience? Or is it still shining with the same brightness, the same freshness, the same clarity, the same transparency in all experience? The reason I call it transparent is that it has no distinguishing features. It has no objective qualities. It cannot be known in the way that a thought or a feeling or a sound can be known. But just because it has no objective qualities does not mean that it is not being experienced, or rather, that it is not experiencing itself. If I were to ask you now, are you knowing your experience? You would say yes. Your mind would say, yes, I know the knowing of experience. Right there, this knowing is saying, I know myself, I experience myself. I experience this transparent, empty knowing that is myself. It is my experience that I am aware. It is my experience that I am knowing my experience. I, the mind, knows the knowing with which I know my experience. In other words, this knowing that knows all experience is self-knowing. Not only does it illuminate all our thoughts, images, feelings, and perceptions, it illuminates itself. It makes itself knowable. It is self-aware, self-luminous. And it is this knowing of knowing, or being aware of being aware, is a unique experience. It is the only experience there is which has no objective quality to it, that has no color to it. It is empty, it is transparent, but it is not nothing. It is no thing, not a thought, not a feeling, not a sensation or a perception. But we cannot say the knowing of experience is nothing. It is everything, but it is not a thing. Now, is this knowing something that is extraordinary or esoteric? Something that I perhaps have some magical access to that none of you have access to? Or that Ramana Maharshi knew all about, but none of us know anything about? Is not the knowing with which we know our experience the most intimate and familiar element of all experience? I mean, how intimate, for instance, is a thought? I mean, how long does a thought last? 3 seconds? That's it. That's our only acquaintance with a thought, lasts for 3 seconds. It's like briefly flirting with someone in a bar and never seeing them again. We call that intimacy. Feelings and sensations may last a little longer, but we are only briefly acquainted with them. But what about the knowing with which we know our experience? How long has that been with you? Has it ever been parted from you? Has it ever let you down? Has it ever gone on strike and said, no, I'm going to cease knowing experience? Try now to turn off the knowing of your experience. When I ask, has this knowing ever been parted from you? I suggest that knowing is one thing and you are something else. What is the name that we commonly give to this knowing? What is the name that we give to that which knows experience? I. Is it not I that knows experience? Do we not all say, I know my thoughts, I know my feelings, I know my perceptions, I know my sensations? I is the name of this pure knowing. Knowing is not a quality or an attribute of I. I simply is knowing, or being aware, or consciousness itself. It is the irreducible element in all experience. The irreducible, indestructible element of experience. This knowing I is not buried in the depths of the body or the mind. It doesn't take years of meditation to access it. This knowing I is shining in all experience. Compare a deep depression and a beautiful walk in nature. Are both experiences not known? And are they not known by the same knowing? One day I know my depression. The next day I see the beautiful landscape. Both experiences are known alike by the same knowing. This knowing is not more available in one experience than it is in another. It is not diminished by the depression. It is not aggrandized by the beautiful walk in nature. It shines brightly in the darkness of depression and in the light of the landscape. No experience diminishes it, or tarnishes it, or changes it, or ages it. Or veils it. The reason it sometimes seems to be missing is precisely because it is so fully present in all experience. It is precisely because the screen is so fully present in all the scenes in a movie that we tend to overlook it. The reason this knowing is sometimes overlooked or forgotten is not because it is too far away or because it is veiled by experience. If anything, it's because it is too close. It is too obvious. It is too present in all experience to be able to be found as an experience. It is never an experience. It is the knowing of all experience. That is you. That is I. This light of knowing that has no gender, that has no age, that shines brightly in all experience, that has never been touched or harmed or diminished or aggrandized by any experience, and yet pervades all experience intimately. It is completely without conditioning, pristine, transparent, empty, luminous, utterly free, unbound by any particular experience, never contained in an experience, never limited by an experience. Boundless, free. Never disturbed by any experience. Never needing anything from any particular experience. Please don't think that I'm now going off into the realms of abstract philosophy or mysticism. I'm talking about the very knowing with which each of us is now knowing our experience. The very knowing that each of us has been calling I all our lives. I have no more access to this knowing than you do. I have no special knowledge about it, no knowledge that you don't have about it. Now, what is the relationship between this knowing and the objects that it knows, the thoughts, feelings, sensations, perceptions? Take a thought or a series of thoughts. Just give your attention to the series of thoughts. And now give your attention to the knowing of the thought. So go back and forth between a thought and the knowing of the thought. Now, hopefully you find that rather difficult to do. I'm sorry, I was playing a mean trick on you. When we go from the thought to the knowing of it, do we go to two different experiences? Do we go back and forth from one experience to another? What is the difference between a thought and the knowing of it? Is it not the same experience? Is there anything to a thought other than the knowing of it? Try now to find some part of a thought which is distinct or other than the knowing of it. Can you find a little bit of the thought which is something other than the knowing of it? Or is all there is to a thought simply the knowing of it? In other words, is there any substance present in a thought other than the knowing of it? What would happen to the thought if we were to remove knowing from it? Would anything remain? all there is to a thought is the knowing of it. But when we say the knowing of it, what is the it we are referring to? There is no it that is known. There is no thought that is known. It's not the knowing of it. It's just knowing. All there is to thinking is knowing. The only substance present in thought is consciousness, awareness, pure knowing, or I. Now take a sound, whatever sounds are present. Play the same trick on yourself. Go back and forth with your attention from the sound to the knowing of it. What is the difference between a sound and the knowing of it? Can you find these two things? One, a sound, and two, the knowing with which it is known? Is there anything to the sound other than the knowing of it? And if there is nothing to the sound apart from the experience of knowing, to what are we referring as it when we say the knowing of it? The it is not there. It's just knowing. Now let your mind range freely over your entire experience. Ask yourself the question, is there any substance present in my experience other than knowing? see that knowing is all that is ever known. And it is this knowing that knows itself. This knowing is all alone. There is nothing in this knowing other than this knowing with which it could be limited. Thus, in its own experience of itself, it is infinite. All finite experience is a coloring of this infinite knowing. It is this infinite knowing that vibrates within itself and appears to itself as the multiplicity and diversity of experience. In other words, the finite mind or finite experience is a coloring of infinite consciousness, just like a movie is a coloring of the unlimited screen. All there is in experience is infinite knowing or infinite consciousness. Or in religious language, God's infinite being. God's infinite self-aware being. The common name for which is I. The only I there truly is, the single, indivisible, indestructible, irreducible, infinite I of pure consciousness.